Imagine it's the late 1980s. The Iron Curtain is starting to crack and the world's best hockey talent is trapped behind it. But one NHL team dared to dream bigger than anyone else. The Vancouver Canucks. In an era of Cold War politics, tense negotiations, and daring strategies, the Canucks pulled off the impossible, landing not one, not two, but three Soviet superstars, Igor Larionov, Vladimir Krutov, and Pavel Bure. How did they do it? Draft rights, bold scouting, secretive contacts, and a management group that refused to take no for an answer. This is the story of how Vancouver became the promised land for Soviet hockey stars. In the late 80s, the Soviet Union went through a ton of political and economic changes. Funding for sports dried up, and this included the elite Red Army hockey program. In order to raise money, they decided it would be best to sell off their top talent, and there was one team that was uniquely positioned to take advantage of this: the Vancouver Canucks. The Canucks had experience in this kind of thing. In '81, they signed Ivan Linka and Yuri Bubla with permission from the Czechoslovakian Hockey Federation. When these signings were announced in July, there was a ton of uproar because Linka's rights were acquired by the Winnipeg Jets, and Bubla's by the Colorado Rockies in a special mini-draft held in May of that year. But the Canucks were way ahead of the curve. They were the first team to approach the Czech Federation for their players, doing so in January of 1981. Canucks general manager Jake Milford and owner Frank Griffiths secretly brokered a deal for the two Czech stars, who refused to play anywhere other than Vancouver. Damn, I miss when Vancouver was a top destination for free agents. But that was Czechoslovakia. Getting players out of the Soviet Union was going to prove much more difficult, but the Canucks were determined. The first step was to take a flyer out on Soviet players in the late rounds of the draft. The top Soviet forwards at the time were Krutov, Larionov, and Makarov. These three formed the famed KLM line, a line that terrorized the international hockey scene. The Canucks took Igor Larionov in the 11th round of the '85 draft and Vladimir Krutov in the 12th round of the '86 draft. Calgary took Sergei Makarov in 1983, so the Canucks were unable to reunite the KLM line in the NHL. The second step was to forge relations with Soviet hockey authorities. This was in case they ever decided to release their players to the NHL. Brian Burke outlines some of the actions taken in his book. He says, "They invited the famous coach Anatoly Tarasov to training camp in 1987. One of the reasons he was happy to make the trip was that the Griffiths family arranged for him to have a hip replacement that Russian doctors had refused to perform." That kinda goes to show you how bad things were in the Soviet Union. Later, when Krutov arrived, the Canucks had to pay for him to get extensive dental work. The Canucks also invited Vladislav Tretiak, the best goalie to never play in the NHL, to run a workshop for their goalies. He showed up with no equipment, and the Canucks had to buy him 2 sets of gear to take back to the Soviet Union. '89 was a monumental year for the Cold War. The Berlin Wall came down, and Soviet stars found the courage to speak out against the state. Igor Larionov stated, "Playing for the National Hockey League is important to many of us because we are tired of the lack of professionalism in Soviet hockey. In the NHL, you can see the difference. The stands are always full. There's plenty of support, and the way they organize matches is a beautiful advertisement for the game." The problems went beyond just professionalism. Many Soviet players mutinied against the insane demands of Red Army coach Viktor Tikhonov. Players were expected to train 10 to 11 months out of the year, which gave them very little time to spend with their families. On top of this, they were expected to carry out their military service. Larionov himself was an officer and stated, "It's easy for a player of the Red Army and the Soviet national team to become an officer, but it's quite a problem to be discharged. Red Army would be a much more cohesive unit if it weren't for the open attempts to enslave its players." Larionov didn't have much hope when he resigned from the military, but behind the scenes, the Canucks were making moves. Burke writes, "The Soviet system was in its death throes, and they were getting ready to sell off some of their best talent. We met with the Russians at the '88 Olympic Games in Calgary and were assured that we were first in line. The commies were broke and decided to capitalize on their talent. How ironic. If you're enjoying this video so far, please drop a like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 25,000 subs in 2025, and I can do it with your help. Thank you." By May of '89, the Soviets announced that they were going to release Larionov, Vyacheslav Fetisov, and Sergei Makarov to their NHL rights holders. It probably had something to do with Mogilny's defection, but that's a story for another day. This was exciting news for the NHL, as a new wave of talent was going to arrive. But they still needed to broker transfer agreements. After the World Championships, Pat Quinn met with Larionov, who indicated his desire to play for Vancouver. Later that year, Cliff Fletcher, GM of the Flames who held Makarov's rights, suggested to Quinn that they go negotiate for their star Soviets together, and Quinn agreed. Burke objected to this, stating, "Don't do it. You're not going to this up, but Cliff is going to f it up. They're going to separate you as soon as you get to Russia, and they're going to get Cliff to agree to a whole bunch of shit that doesn't make sense. And that's exactly what happened. The Soviets split the two GMs apart, made a favorable deal for themselves with Fletcher, who was a very bad negotiator, and presented the same deal to Quinn, who was forced to accept. It was a raw deal for the Canucks, but even worse for Larionov, who had to give half of his salary to the Soviet Ice Hockey Federation. Somehow that's still better than Sergei Pryakin, who had to give a whopping 90% of his salary to the Soviet Federation. The cost of freedom, I guess. The Canucks then shifted their attention to Krutov, who received permission to negotiate with the Canucks shortly after the Larionov deal was made. While waiting for his release from the Red Army, he stated, "I'm trying to keep fit by playing tennis and soccer. If I get my release from the army, I should be playing with the Canucks sometime this year, before Christmas." I personally don't think he was doing any strength and conditioning that offseason, because he showed up to camp over 200 pounds. That doesn't sound like a lot, but mind you, he was 5'9". He was an absolute disaster. Larionov predicted that he would score 40 goals. He only scored 11. He was criticized for his lazy play, and even Pat Quinn said, "We knew it would be a process, but 2 or 3 years? I don't know if we can wait that long." Vladimir came, not for the opportunity. Maybe it was a favor to Igor. And that makes sense because Larionov had to do a lot of convincing to get his line mate to make the jump to North America. In the end, Krutov couldn't thrive outside the Soviet system. Larionov said, "When we work with the Red Army team, there is always a coach over you 2 or 3 times a day, cracking the whip. You are never taught to think or act for yourself." Say what you want about Tikhonov, but he had Krutov dialed in. Krutov just lacked the self-motivation and discipline required in the NHL. Even his interpreter said Vladimir is lost in some strange society. Not speaking English didn't help. And Krutov was also an old-school Soviet. He had never been outside the Iron Curtain. Without the strict Soviet training regimen, he was like a fish out of water. And he drank like a fish too. Brian Burke criticizes him harshly in his book. He was a peasant, a hockey-playing peasant who was way past his prime, and drank way too much. He soaked us for a lot of money. I remember Doug Lidster was driving him to the airport one day. Krutov was sitting in the back, and all of a sudden, Liddy heard him cracking a beer. Liddy had to explain to him that we don't do that here. I swear to God, Krutov sounds like a character straight out of a Dostoevsky novel. And it wasn't just Krutov who took the Canucks to the cleaners. The Russians wanted the remainder of their development fee. All $750,000 of it. In March of '91, the Canucks had an opportunity to settle for $400,000, but were confident that the case would be thrown out. In '92, arbitration took place in Stockholm, Sweden, and Brian Burke was so sure that the Canucks would win that he refused to settle again. They lost over $1 million once all the arbitrators' fees and interest was tallied up. Brian Burke was so distressed that he couldn't visit Stockholm again for almost a decade. Larionov, on the other hand, was a real treat. More of a gentleman and attuned to the Western way of life. He already spoke English before moving to Vancouver, and this helped him transition greatly. On the ice, he was a wizard. Burke even wrote, "What a hockey player. Our whole team changed the first day he came to practice. He started making passes that guys weren't expecting. We got sharper immediately. His numbers don't pop off the screen. He only scored 44 points in his first season, but he was a cerebral player who made his wingers better." When Bure arrived in Larionov's third season, his production rose to 65 points in 72 games. What surprised many hockey fans was the fact that Larionov and Krutov couldn't carry over their chemistry in the NHL. Now, most of this was due to Krutov, and Larionov eventually became sick and tired of the drunk Krutov. He said at a press conference, "Please, I don't want to talk about him. Krutov has his own life. I have my own life. I want nothing to do with him." A rift between two Canuck teammates? Some things just never change. Whereas Krutov was just there for a check, Larionov's only regret was that he didn't come to the NHL sooner. His family was treated well by the community and adjusted to life in Canada, but his 3 seasons in Vancouver weren't without controversy. Larionov was a highly intelligent individual, well-spoken, and decided to write a book about his time in the Soviet Union. His criticism of Soviet hockey was scathing. According to an LA Times article from 1989, Larionov alleges in his book that Soviet hockey players and lab workers conspired to deceive drug testers at the 1986 World Championships in Moscow by switching urine specimens in the toilets. He also accused Tikhonov of forcing players to receive injections of an unknown substance. I have zero doubt whatsoever Larionov is telling the truth. Go and watch the movie Icarus and it will all make sense. Larionov's time in Vancouver came to an end after Bure's rookie year, which was unfortunate because they could have used him in '94. Quinn felt bad for Larionov because half his check was going back to the Russian Federation, so he let him go back to Europe to break free of the deal. The Canucks didn't expect Larionov to come back, so they waived him in the expansion draft. One man's trash is another man's treasure, and the Sharks claimed Larionov. Larionov eventually joined the Red Wings' famed Russian Five and helped them win 3 Stanley Cups. He's now a member of the Hockey Hall of Fame. Krutov's story, unfortunately, has a tragic ending. He died in 2012 at the age of 52 due to internal bleeding, probably from excessive drinking. It was really a shame he was unable to adapt to life after hockey. After his passing, Pat Quinn stated, "He didn't have any English and was a peasant in terms of his upbringing. He was certainly a good hockey player, but unlike Larionov, who was able to make the transition quite easily and welcomed it, Krutov was homesick right away. It was a terrible experience for him. His passing is sad. We never got to know him really well." I hate to end on a sad note, but thanks for watching part 1 of this 2-part series on how the Canucks became a top destination for Soviet hockey stars. In part 2, we're going to discuss Pavel Bure, the Russian Rocket. So make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification icon to be notified when that video is released. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.